The phone buzzed against the marble countertop of Cassandra Storm's downtown Chicago apartment at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. She almost didn't answer. Another unknown number from area code 605, probably another telemarketer who didn't respect time zones. But something made her swipe to accept the call. Perhaps the same instinct that had made her a successful investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune. "Cassie?" The voice was barely a whisper, cracked and trembling. "Cassie, is that you, sweetheart?" Her blood ran cold. She hadn't heard that voice in 3 months, not since their argument about him refusing to move closer to family. "Grandpa Frank? What's wrong? It's almost midnight." They put me somewhere, Cassie." Franklin Douglas's voice broke, and she could hear him crying, something she'd never witnessed in her 28 years of life. "I don't know how it happened. I was in my house yesterday, and now I'm in this place with strangers, and they won't let me leave. They took my keys, Cassie. They took my keys." The words hit her like a physical blow. Cassandra Storm, who had interviewed senators and exposed corruption without flinching, felt her hands shake as she gripped the phone. "Where are you, Grandpa? What place?" "Some nursing home in Rapid City, Sunset Manor, they call it." "But Cassie," he dropped to a whisper, "I think your Aunt Margaret did something. She had papers. She said I couldn't take care of myself anymore, but that's not true. I was doing just fine in my house. Just fine." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cassandra Storm had always been the family rebel. The one who asked uncomfortable questions at Thanksgiving dinner and refused to accept simple answers. Growing up in the small farming community of Millbrook, South Dakota, she'd been the girl who read newspapers instead of romance novels, who chose journalism school over staying home to help run the family's struggling grain elevator business. Her relationship with her grandfather, Franklin Douglas, had been the one constant through all the family tensions. While her parents, Robert and Linda Storm, worried about practical things like crop yields and mortgage payments, and while her Aunt Margaret, Douglas Patterson, had always been obsessed with appearances and social status in their tiny town, Grandpa Frank had been different. He was the one who taught Cassie to question everything, to dig deeper, to never accept the first version of any story. Frank Douglas was 83 years old, a retired railroad engineer who had lived in the same house on Elm Street in Millbrook for 57 years, the house where he'd raised Cassandra's father and Aunt Margaret after their mother died young, the house where he'd cared for his wife Dorothy through her battle with Alzheimer's until she passed 5 years ago, the house that held every memory that mattered to him. 3 months ago, Cassandra had driven the 400 miles from Chicago to Millbrook for what she thought would be a routine visit. She'd found her grandfather exactly as she always had, sharp as a tack, puttering around his vegetable garden, reading 3 newspapers a day, and maintaining his house with the same meticulous care he'd once applied to train engines. But the family was worried. Her father had mentioned that Frank was getting forgetful, though when pressed for examples, he could only cite things like Frank forgetting to return a neighbor's phone call, or occasionally asking the same question twice during a conversation. Her Aunt Margaret had been more dramatic, claiming Frank was becoming a danger to himself and others, though she refused to provide specifics when Cassandra asked. The real issue, Cassandra had realized during that visit, wasn't Frank's mental state. It was the family's financial anxiety. The grain elevator business was failing, crushed between corporate agriculture and a series of bad harvests. Her parents were facing bankruptcy. Aunt Margaret's husband had been laid off from the ethanol plant. Everyone was looking at Frank's house,
prime real estate in the center of town, fully paid off, worth enough to solve several family members' financial problems. During that July visit, Frank had confided his fears to Cassandra over coffee in his kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd learned to make pie crust and where he'd helped her with algebra homework during high school. "They keep bringing up that I should sell the house, move into one of those senior places," he'd said, stirring sugar into his coffee with hands that were still steady. "They say it would be easier for me. But Cassie, this house, your grandmother's roses are still blooming in the backyard. Her recipe box is still in that drawer. I can still smell her perfume in our bedroom sometimes." "You don't have to go anywhere, Grandpa," Cassandra had assured him. "You're doing fine here." "That's what I keep telling them, but Margaret keeps talking about what's best and being responsible. She's got power of attorney, you know. Set that up when your grandmother was sick in case something happened to me, too. I never thought." He'd trailed off, staring out the window at the garden he'd tended for decades. That conversation had ended in an argument when Cassandra confronted her aunt about the pressure they were putting on Frank. Margaret had accused Cassandra of not understanding the realities of caring for an aging parent, of being too busy with her fancy career to see that Frank needed more help than he was admitting. "You visit for a weekend and think you know everything," Margaret had snapped. "You don't see him when he gets confused about his medications. You don't see him when he forgets to eat lunch or leaves the stove on." "Have any of those things actually happened?" Cassandra had pressed. "Well, they could happen. At his age, living alone, anything could happen." The argument had escalated until Cassandra stormed out, promising Frank she'd be back soon, but knowing the 400-mile drive and her demanding job at the Tribune made frequent visits difficult.
Now, 3 months later, her worst fears had apparently come true. After Frank's midnight call, Cassandra had spent the rest of the night researching Sunset Manor online, making phone calls, and trying to piece together what had happened. The nursing home's website showed a modern facility with smiling staff and residents enjoying activities, but the reviews told a different story. Complaints about understaffing, poor communication with families, and residents being heavily medicated to keep them compliant. More disturbing were the legal documents she found through her journalist contacts. Margaret Douglas Patterson had indeed activated her power of attorney, claiming that Frank had become incapacitated due to dementia and unsafe living conditions. She had sold Frank's house to a property development company, the same company that had been trying to buy up downtown Millbrook properties for a new shopping complex. The sale had happened fast, just 2 weeks ago. Frank had been moved to Sunset Manor immediately afterward, with Margaret citing immediate safety concerns that required emergency placement. But Cassandra's phone calls to neighbors in Millbrook told a different story. Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door to Frank, was shocked to learn he'd been moved. "Moved? When? I saw him working in his garden just last week. He brought me tomatoes on Saturday. He seemed fine to me." "Better than fine, actually. He was excited about some project he was working on. Said he was organizing all his railroad memorabilia for a museum donation." Other neighbors confirmed the same thing. Frank had been active, social, and mentally sharp right up until he disappeared from his house. No one had seen any signs of confusion or unsafe behavior. As dawn broke over Chicago, Cassandra made her decision. She called in sick to work, threw clothes into a duffel bag, and headed for her car. 400 miles of interstate stretched between her and the truth. But she'd driven that road countless times before. This time felt different, though. This time, she wasn't just visiting family. She was racing to save the one person who had always believed in her. The October morning was crisp and clear as she merged onto I-90 West, her phone buzzing with missed calls from Margaret, calls she wasn't ready to take yet. First, she needed to see her grandfather, hear his side of the story, and understand exactly what had happened in that house on Elm Street. But as the Chicago skyline faded in her rearview mirror and the familiar landscape of the Midwest opened up before her,
Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that she was already too late. The system that was supposed to protect elderly people like her grandfather had been weaponized against him, and the family she had trusted had betrayed the strongest person she'd ever known. The speedometer crept up to 85 as she pressed harder on the accelerator. 400 miles had never felt so far.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The 4-hour drive to Rapid City gave Cassandra too much time to think, and not enough answers. She'd tried calling Sunset Manor 3 times, but each attempt had been met with the same scripted response from the front desk. Mr. Douglas is settling in well, and visiting hours are from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. You'll need to speak with our family liaison about any concerns. When she'd asked to speak with her grandfather directly, she was told that residents weren't allowed personal phone calls during an adjustment period, typically the first 2 weeks of placement. The policy, explained in a tone that brooked no argument, was designed to help new residents acclimate without outside confusion. Cassandra had covered enough stories about institutional abuse to recognize the warning signs: isolation, controlled communication, rapid placement without proper evaluation. Everything about this situation screamed wrongful commitment, but she needed evidence, not just suspicion. Her first stop wasn't the nursing home. Instead, she drove straight to Elm Street in Millbrook, to the house that had been her grandfather's for over half a century. What she found there made her stomach turn. The house stood empty, but it wasn't the peaceful emptiness of a home between owners. Windows were broken. The front door hung open, secured only by a piece of yellow caution tape that fluttered in the October wind. Frank's prized vegetable garden had been torn up by heavy machinery, leaving gouges of exposed earth where neat rows of tomatoes and beans had flourished just weeks before. Cassandra walked through the destruction, her journalist eye cataloging details. This wasn't the orderly emptying of a house being prepared for sale. This looked like deliberate destruction. Furniture was overturned. Family photos lay scattered on the floor, glass crunched under her feet. In the kitchen where she'd shared countless conversations with her grandfather, cabinet doors hung open and contents were strewn across the counters. Terrible shame, isn't it? Cassandra spun around to find Mrs. Henderson, Frank's neighbor, standing in the doorway. The elderly woman's face was drawn with worry and anger. "Mrs. Henderson, what happened here? When did this happen?" "Started the day after they took Frank away. Company came with big trucks, said they were clearing and preparing the property. But this," she gestured at the destruction around them, "this was just meanness. They could have boxed things up proper, but instead they just threw everything around like it was garbage." Mrs. Henderson led Cassandra through the house, pointing out details that told a darker story. "See here? This was Frank's workshop in the basement. He had 40 years of railroad memorabilia down there. Lanterns, conductor's watches, photographs, documents. He was organizing it all for that museum donation he was so excited about." The basement workshop had been completely gutted, not cleaned out, destroyed. Tools that Frank had maintained meticulously were scattered and bent. Filing cabinets had been overturned, their contents dumped and trampled. What should have been a careful preservation of historical artifacts looked more like vandalism. "They didn't even try to save anything," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice shaking with indignation. "Frank spent months getting those railroad documents in order. He had correspondence with the South Dakota Railroad Museum, letters from the Historical Society, all of it just thrown away like trash." Cassandra felt a cold fury building in her chest. Who supervised this? Was Margaret here? Oh, she was here all right. Stood on the front porch with some man in a suit, pointing at things and making notes on a clipboard. When I tried to talk to her, asked her what Frank thought about all this, she told me it wasn't my concern. Said Frank was no longer capable of making decisions about his possessions. Cassandra felt a cold fury building in her chest. Did she take anything? Any personal items? Family photos? That's the strange part. They loaded up a U-Haul truck, but it wasn't very full. Mostly just took some furniture, the good pieces, the antiques. Left all the personal stuff behind. All of Frank's clothes, his books,
Your grandmother's things? They just left it all here for the cleanup crew to destroy. In Dorothy's old sewing room, Cassandra found confirmation of Mrs. Henderson's account. Her grandmother's sewing machine sat in the corner, covered in dust and debris, but untouched by the destruction crews. The closet still held Dorothy's dresses, still smelled faintly of lavender perfume. These weren't the belongings of someone who had planned to move. These were the possessions of someone who had been torn away from their life without warning. Mrs. Henderson, in the weeks before Frank was taken, did you notice anything different about him? Any confusion? Any signs he was having trouble? The older woman's expression grew even more troubled. That's what's so terrible about all this, Cassandra. Frank was doing better than he had in years. After your grandmother passed, he went through a real low period then. We all worried about him then. But lately, he seemed to have found his purpose again. She led Cassandra back upstairs to Frank's living room, where his favorite chair sat overturned near the window. He was up every morning at 6, just like when he worked for the railroad. He'd tend his garden, then spend hours in that workshop organizing his collection. He was writing letters to museums, researching the history of different railroad lines. He even started a correspondence with some professor at the University of South Dakota who was interested in his photographs. I mentioned that project to him, Cassandra said, remembering their last conversation. He was so excited about it, said he was finally going to make sure all that railroad history didn't get lost. He had found some photographs of the original construction crews from the 1920s, documents about the early grain shipments, real historical treasure, he called it. Mrs. Henderson picked up a torn photograph from the floor, a black and white image of a steam locomotive with a crew of workers posed beside it. This was one of his favorites. He said that's his father, second from the left. 3 generations of Douglas men worked for the railroad, you know. The more Cassandra learned, the clearer the picture became. Frank hadn't been placed in a nursing home because he was failing. He'd been removed because he was thriving in a way that interfered with other people's plans for his property. Mrs. Henderson, in the weeks before Frank was taken, did Frank ever mention feeling pressured about selling the house? Oh my, yes. Your aunt was here almost weekly these past few months, always with different people, real estate agents, even a bank appraiser once. Frank would get so upset after those visits. He'd come over here for coffee and just shake his head, say he couldn't understand why everyone was so eager to get rid of him.
Did he ever seem confused during these conversations? Like he didn't understand what was happening? Confused? No, honey, he understood perfectly. That's what made him so upset. He knew exactly what they were trying to do, and he kept saying no. He must have told me a dozen times, I'm not ready to give up my independence, Helen. This house is all I have left of Dorothy and the life we built together. The picture was becoming clearer, but Cassandra needed more than neighbor testimony. She needed documentation, official records that would prove Frank's competency at the time of his placement. Her next stop was Dr. Martinez's office on Main Street. Frank had been seeing the same family doctor for 15 years, and if there were genuine concerns about his mental state, they would be documented in his medical records. Dr. Martinez was reluctant to discuss Frank's case initially, citing patient privacy concerns. But when Cassandra explained the circumstances and showed him photos of the destroyed house, his professional demeanor shifted to one of genuine concern. I can't discuss specific medical details, he said carefully, but I can tell you that I saw Frank for his regular checkup just 3 weeks ago. He was here for his annual physical and to renew his driver's license medical certification. Driver's license renewal? At 83? South Dakota allows license renewal up to age 85 with medical clearance. Frank passed all the cognitive assessments, vision tests, reaction time evaluations. In fact, his scores were better than many patients have his age. Dr. Martinez pulled out a folder and showed Cassandra the standardized cognitive assessment forms. These tests screen for dementia, confusion, memory loss. Frank scored in the 95th percentile for his age group. There were no indicators of cognitive decline whatsoever. So 3 weeks ago, a medical professional certified that my grandfather was mentally competent to drive a car, but somehow he's now so incapacitated that he needs round-the-clock nursing care? I can't speak to the nursing home placement,
but I can tell you that anyone who claimed Frank Douglas was mentally incapacitated 3 weeks ago would be contradicting documented medical evidence. The doctor's words confirmed what Cassandra had suspected, but they also raised a new question. If Frank was medically certified as competent, how had Margaret managed to activate power of attorney and have him committed? The answer came from her next stop, the office of Margaret's lawyer, Thomas Brennan, on the second floor of Millbrook's only office building. Brennan was expecting her. Margaret had apparently called ahead to warn him that Cassandra was stirring up trouble and interfering with necessary family decisions. But Brennan seemed uncomfortable with the situation, and when Cassandra pressed him for details about the legal process, his answers raised more red flags. The power of attorney was activated based on emergency circumstances, he explained, avoiding eye contact. When a person becomes unable to care for themselves safely, immediate family can petition for emergency guardianship. What emergency circumstances? My grandfather was living independently, maintaining his house, passing medical evaluations. There were reports of concerning behavior, safety issues. From who? What kind of reports? Brennan shuffled through papers on his desk, clearly uncomfortable. Adult Protective Services received a complaint about Mr. Douglas being unable to maintain his property, exhibiting signs of confusion, and being at risk of self-harm. Who filed that complaint? The reporting party requested anonymity, as is their right under state law. But Cassandra knew the law too, and she knew the right questions to ask. Mr. Brennan, was Adult Protective Services able to substantiate those claims with an independent investigation? The lawyer's pause told her everything she needed to know. The placement was expedited due to the urgent nature of the safety concerns. So no investigation was conducted. No independent assessment of my grandfather's condition or living situation. Someone made an anonymous complaint, and based solely on that complaint, you helped my aunt have him committed and sell his house? It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Cassandra stood up, her journalist instincts firing on all cylinders. And I'm going to find out who made that complaint, and I'm going to expose exactly how this system failed my grandfather. As she left Brennan's office, Cassandra understood that what had happened to Frank wasn't just family dysfunction or well-meaning but misguided concern. This was systematic elder abuse enabled by legal loopholes and executed with surgical precision to separate Frank from his assets while making it look like compassionate care. The sun was setting as she drove toward Rapid City, and her first face-to-face encounter with the people who now controlled her grandfather's life. But she was no longer just a granddaughter worried about family dynamics. She was an investigative journalist who had uncovered a story that needed to be told, and a system that needed to be challenged. The real fight was just beginning. Sunset Manor sat on the outskirts of Rapid City like a fortress designed to keep the world out rather than welcome visitors in. The building itself was modern enough, red brick facade, manicured landscaping, and a circular driveway that suggested prosperity and care. But as Cassandra pulled into the parking lot at 7:30 p.m., well past visiting hours, she noticed details that told a different story. The windows were equipped with security screens. The main entrance required keycard access after hours. Motion sensor lighting tracked her movement across the parking lot like searchlights. This wasn't a retirement community or assisted living facility. This was a lockdown facility designed to contain rather than nurture its residents. The night receptionist, a tired-looking woman named Sharon, initially refused to let Cassandra see Frank. Visiting hours ended at 6 p.m., and Mr. Douglas is probably sleeping. New residents need their rest during the adjustment period. I just drove 400 miles to see my grandfather. I'll wait until morning if necessary, but I'm not leaving without seeing him. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but our policies exist for the residents' well-being. Mr. Douglas has been here less than 2 weeks, and disrupting his routine— What routine? Cassandra interrupted. He's been here 12 days. What routine could he possibly have established in 12 days that's more important than seeing his granddaughter? The receptionist glanced nervously at a clipboard, then at the security camera mounted above the desk. I'd need to check with our night supervisor, but she's currently doing medication rounds. Then I'll wait. Cassandra took a seat in the sterile lobby, pulling out her phone to document everything she could see. The facility was clean, but institutional. Generic landscape paintings, furniture that prioritized durability over comfort, and that particular smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with cafeteria food that seemed universal to institutional care. What disturbed her most was the silence. For a building housing over 100 elderly residents, Sunset Manor was eerily quiet. No conversations, no television sounds, no evidence of life or activity despite the early evening hour. After 45 minutes, a tall woman in scrubs appeared from the elevator bank. "Miss Storm, I'm Linda Kowalski, the night care supervisor. I understand you're here to see Mr. Douglas." "Yes, I am. And I understand you're going to tell me why that's not possible." Linda's expression softened slightly. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk. Your grandfather has been struggling with the adjustment. Maybe seeing a familiar face would help." They rode the elevator to the third floor in silence, but as the doors opened, Cassandra was hit by a new set of disturbing details. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with rooms whose doors all bore keypads. The nursing station at the center of the floor was enclosed in glass, like a guard post overseeing a cell block. "Is this the memory care unit?" Cassandra asked. "No, this is general assisted living, but we use security protocols for all residents during their initial adjustment period. It helps prevent wandering and reduces anxiety." "Wandering? My grandfather has never had issues with wandering. He's lived in the same house for 57 years. Linda paused outside room 314, her hand on the keypad. "Miss Storm, I need to prepare you. Your grandfather has been resistant to care since his arrival. He's refused medications, won't participate in activities, and has been verbally combative with staff." "Verbally combative how?" "He keeps insisting he doesn't belong here. He claims he was brought here against his will and demands to go home. Yesterday, he tried to leave through the emergency exit, which triggered our security protocols." Cassandra felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak. Even locked up and isolated, Frank was still fighting. Did it occur to anyone that maybe he's right? That maybe he doesn't belong here? Linda's expression grew guarded. "Miss Storm, I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've seen hundreds of families struggle with the difficult decision to place a loved one in care. Resistance is normal. Denial is normal. But accepting help is part of the healing process. What if he doesn't need to heal? What if he needs to go home?" The keypad beeped, and Linda pushed open the door to reveal a small room dominated by a hospital bed, a single chair, and a narrow window that looked out on the parking lot. Frank Douglas sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed despite the late hour, staring out that window as if he could will himself through it and back to his real life. "Grandpa Frank?" He turned at her voice, and Cassandra's heart broke at what he saw. In the 2 weeks since his placement, Frank seemed to have aged years. His shoulders were stooped in a way that she had never seen before. His eyes, always so sharp and alert, looked clouded and confused. Not with dementia, but with the fog of medication and institutional routine. "Cassie? Cassie, is that really you, or am I dreaming again?" She rushed to him, wrapping him in a hug that felt more fragile than any embrace they'd had ever shared. "I'm real, Grandpa. I'm here. I knew you'd come. I told them you'd come, but they said family needed time to adjust to my new situation." He looked over at Linda with undisguised contempt. "New situation? Like I chose to be in this prison." "Mr. Douglas, please don't upset yourself," Linda said automatically. "Your grandfather is here now, and that's what matters." "Don't upset myself?" Frank's voice gained strength, and for a moment Cassandra glimpsed the man she remembered. "They dragged me out of my home in the middle of the night, destroy everything I owned, lock me in this room, and you tell me not to upset myself?" Cassandra looked sharply at Linda. "In the middle of the night? I was told this was a planned transition."
"I was sleeping," Frank said, his voice shaking with anger and hurt. It was 2 in the morning when they came. 2 men I'd never seen before, with some papers they said gave them the right to take me. They wouldn't even let me pack a bag, Cassie. Said everything would be taken care of. Mr. Douglas, you were in distress that night, Lynna interjected. The emergency placement was necessary for your safety. Emergency placement? Cassandra's journalist instincts kicked into high gear. What kind of emergency requires removing someone from their home at 2 a.m.? Linda's uncomfortable pause spoke volumes. There were concerns about Mr. Douglas's immediate safety. The details are in his intake file, which I can't discuss without proper authorization. From who? I'm his granddaughter. From his legal guardian. His niece, Margaret Patterson, has medical power of attorney. Frank grabbed Cassandra's hand with surprising strength. They won't let me call anyone. They took my wallet, my phone, even my house keys. They said I don't need them anymore because I'm home now. His voice cracked on the word home. I still don't understand the emergency that required immediate removal, Cassandra pressed. Linda checked her watch nervously. Miss Storm, visiting hours are really over. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow during regular hours and speak with our family liaison. No, Frank's voice was firm. Cassie, don't leave me here tonight. Please don't leave me here tonight. The desperation in his voice was unlike anything Cassandra had ever heard from the strong, independent man who had raised her father and been her anchor through every childhood crisis. I'm not leaving, Grandpa. I'm staying right here in Rapid City until we figure this out. Ma'am, family members can't stay overnight. I'm not staying in the building. I'm staying in town, and I'll be back first thing in the morning. She turned back to Frank. Tell me everything, Grandpa. Everything you remember about that night, about how you got here. Over the next hour, despite Linda's increasingly frequent interruptions about visiting hours and resident sleep schedules, Frank told his story in fragments that painted a picture of systematic abduction disguised as medical care. He'd been awakened by pounding on his front door. 2 men in uniforms had shown him papers, an emergency court order authorizing his immediate removal for psychiatric evaluation and protection. They'd claimed he was in imminent danger and needed immediate medical attention. He asked them what danger, what medical attention. He felt fine. He'd been fine all day. Had dinner with the Hendersons, worked in my garden, read my book before bed. Nothing wrong with me at all. But the men had insisted. They'd called an ambulance, though Frank hadn't needed medical transport. They'd strapped him to a gurney despite his protests, citing safety protocols. The ambulance had brought him directly to Sunset Manor, where he'd been admitted as an emergency psychiatric hold. They put me in this room and locked the door, told me I'd be evaluated by a doctor in the morning, but Cassie, I never saw any doctor. Just nurses who kept trying to give me pills I didn't need. What kind of pills? He gestured toward the bedside table where several pill bottles sat lined up like soldiers. Anti-anxiety medication, they said, to help me adjust. But I wasn't anxious until they locked me in here. Cassandra examined the medication bottles. Lorazepam, quetiapine, trazodone, powerful psychiatric medications that would explain Frank's clouded appearance and confusion. Grandpa, are you taking these? I tried to refuse them, but they said it was doctor's orders, said if I didn't cooperate with my treatment plan, they couldn't help me get better. Better from what? That's what I keep asking them. Better from what? Linda was growing more agitated during this conversation, repeatedly checking her phone and glancing toward the door. Finally, she interrupted firmly. Miss Storm, I really need you to wrap up this visit. Mr. Douglas needs his evening medications and rest. Evening medications? It's 8:30 at night, and you want to give an 83-year-old man sedatives? It's part of his prescribed treatment plan. Prescribed by whom? What doctor evaluated him and determined he needed psychiatric medication? Linda's silence was answer enough.
As Cassandra prepared to leave, Frank gripped her hand desperately. "Don't let them keep me here, Cassie. I'll die in this place. Not from sickness, from forgetting who I am. I won't let that happen, Grandpa. I promise you, I won't let that happen." But as she walked back through the locked corridors, past the guard station nursing desk, and through the keycard-protected exits, Cassandra realized she had made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The system that had swallowed her grandfather was designed to be impenetrable, protected by medical privacy laws, legal guardianship rules, and the assumption that institutions always knew better than families. Her phone buzzed as she reached her car. A text from Margaret. "Heard you're in town stirring up trouble. Frank is exactly where he needs to be. Stop interfering with his care." Cassandra stared at the message, then typed back, "His care? Is that what you call drugging a healthy man and locking him in a room? We need to talk." The response came immediately. "Nothing to discuss. I'm doing what's best for Dad. You haven't been around enough to understand his condition." But Cassandra had seen enough to understand that Frank's only condition was being inconvenient to people who wanted his assets more than his well-being, and she was beginning to understand that getting him out would require more than family loyalty. It would require exposing a system that profited from the warehousing of elderly people who were guilty of nothing more than owning valuable property. The real battle was just beginning, and Cassandra was starting to realize how many powerful interests stood between her grandfather and his freedom. Cassandra spent a sleepless night in the Hampton Inn, her laptop open as she researched everything she could find about elder guardianship laws, emergency psychiatric holds, and the specific regulations governing nursing home placements in South Dakota. What she discovered made her stomach churn with the systematic nature of legal elder abuse. The process that had trapped Frank was shockingly simple and almost impossible to reverse. Any relative with power of attorney could petition for emergency guardianship based on credible reports of incapacitation. Once that petition was filed, the elderly person could be removed from their home and placed in institutional care while awaiting a competency hearing, a hearing that could be delayed for months while the person remained locked up and medicated. Most disturbing was the financial incentive structure. Nursing homes received higher reimbursement rates for residents classified as having behavioral or psychiatric issues, creating a monetary motivation to keep residents medicated and compliant rather than addressing their actual needs. At 8 a.m. sharp, Cassandra was back at Sunset Manor, this time armed with legal knowledge and a recording app on her phone. She dressed in her most professional attire, the navy blazer and pressed slacks she wore for serious interviews, and carried a leather portfolio that made her look like an attorney rather than a concerned granddaughter. The day supervisor, Janet Holbrook, was a different breed from the sympathetic Linda. Holbrook was all business, with the demeanor of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of institutional gatekeeping. "Miss Storm, I understand you visited your grandfather last night during off hours. While we appreciate family involvement, we need to maintain proper boundaries for the safety and well-being of all our residents." "I understand you need to follow protocols," Cassandra replied evenly, "but I also need to understand the medical and legal basis for my grandfather's placement here. Can you walk me through his admission process?" Holbrook's smile was polished, but cold. "Certainly. Mr. Douglas was admitted under an emergency psychiatric hold after family members expressed concerns about his safety and cognitive function. Our medical team evaluated him and determined that he required supervised care." "I'd like to see the documentation from that medical evaluation." "I'm afraid that information can only be released to his legal guardian, which is his niece, Margaret Patterson." "I understand. Then I'd like to speak with the doctor who conducted the evaluation." "Dr. Reeves only visits on Tuesdays and Fridays, but I can schedule an appointment." "It's Friday. Is he here today?" Holbrook's pause was telling. "Dr. Reeves is quite busy with his rounds. Perhaps next Tuesday would be better." Cassandra made a note in her portfolio. How many patients does Dr. Reeves see here at Sunset Manor? I'm not sure I understand the relevance. Simple question. How many of your 100-plus residents has Dr. Reeves personally evaluated and signed off on? Another pause. Dr. Reeves oversees the medical care of all our residents. That's not what I asked. How many has he personally examined and evaluated? The dance continued for 20 minutes, with Holbrook providing bureaucratic non-answers to every direct question. But Cassandra's journalistic training had taught her to listen for what wasn't being said as much as what was. The picture emerging was of a facility that operated more like a holding center than a medical institution, with minimal doctor oversight and maximum reliance on sedating medications to maintain order. When she finally got to see Frank, she found him in far worse condition than the night before. He was sitting in a wheelchair in what they called the activity room, a sterile space with a few tables where residents sat staring at a television playing old game shows at high volume. Frank looked heavily sedated, his eyes unfocused and his head nodding as he struggled to stay awake. "Grandpa, how are you feeling?" "Cassie?" His voice was thick, like he was speaking through cotton. "I'm so tired, sweetheart. They gave me new medicine this morning, said it would help with my... what did they call it? My adjustment difficulties? What time did they give you the medicine?" "Early. Before breakfast. The nurse said I was being disruptive last night after you left." Cassandra looked around the activity room. Frank was the only resident who appeared alert enough to hold a conversation. The others sat in various states of medicated stupor, some asleep in their chairs, others staring blankly at the television. "Grandpa, what did you do that was disruptive?" Frank struggled to focus on her face. "I asked to use the phone, wanted to call my lawyer, call the police, told them I was being held against my will. They said that kind of talk was upsetting the other residents. So they increased your medication?" "I think so. Everything's so fuzzy now, Cassie. I can't think straight." Cassandra felt a white-hot rage building inside her. What she was witnessing wasn't medical care, it was chemical restraint designed to silence Frank's protests and make him easier to manage. A cheerful voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Douglas, how are we feeling today?" The woman approaching was young, probably fresh out of college, wearing scrubs decorated with cartoon characters and a name tag reading, "Ashley, Activity Coordinator." "We're having a wonderful morning in the activity room, aren't we? In a few minutes, we'll be starting our music therapy session. Do you like music, Mr. Douglas?" Frank looked at Ashley with confusion. "Music therapy? I don't need therapy. I need to go home."
Ashley's smile never wavered. "Home is wherever you feel safe and cared for, Mr. Douglas. And you're very safe here at Sunset Manor." "But this isn't my home," Frank said, his medicated mind struggling to process the conversation. "My home is on Elm Street, with Dorothy's garden and my workshop." "Sometimes our memories can get confused," Ashley said gently. "But that's okay. We're here to help you make new memories." Cassandra had heard enough. "Excuse me, Ashley. My grandfather isn't confused about where he lived. He's been in the same house for 57 years. Ashley's smile flickered slightly. "Family members sometimes find it difficult to accept changes in their loved one's condition. It's very common for new residents to talk about wanting to go home. It's part of the adjustment process." What if he doesn't need to adjust? What if he actually should go home? "Oh, that's not really my department. Those kinds of decisions are made by the medical team and the family's legal guardian." The circular reasoning was maddening. Frank was here because he supposedly needed to be here, and he needed to be here because he was here. Any protests were evidence of confusion that justified more medication, which created more confusion that justified continued placement.
During their conversation, Ashley had been preparing for the music therapy session, setting up a small keyboard and arranging chairs in a circle. Other staff members began wheeling residents over, creating a group of about 15 elderly people in various states of alertness. "Today we're going to sing some songs from the good old days," Ashley announced brightly. "Let's start with You Are My Sunshine." As Ashley began playing, something remarkable happened. Frank's head lifted slightly, and despite the fog of medication, he began to mouth the words. Other residents showed similar sparks of recognition, their eyes gaining focus as familiar melodies triggered deep memories. But then Cassandra noticed something that made her blood run cold. A male nurse named Derek was moving through the group with a medication cart, quietly distributing pills to residents during the music session. Not emergency medications. These appeared to be routine sedatives, given to residents who were showing too much alertness or animation. When Derek approached Frank with a small paper cup containing pills, Cassandra intervened. "What are those medications?" "Just Mr. Douglas's afternoon anxiety medication," Derek replied smoothly. "He doesn't look anxious. He looks like he's enjoying the music. Sometimes emotional stimulation can trigger anxiety in our residents. It's better to prevent problems before they start." Frank looked at the pills, then at Cassandra, confusion and fear clouding his drugged features. "I don't want more medicine. I just want to listen to the music." "I know, Mr. Douglas, but this will help you feel more comfortable," Derek insisted, holding out the cup. "He said he doesn't want them," Cassandra said firmly. Derek's friendly demeanor shifted slightly. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to not interfere with our medical protocols. Mr. Douglas is prescribed these medications for his own well-being." "By what doctor? Dr. Reeves, who apparently only visits twice a week and has never actually examined him?" "I'm going to need to ask you to step back, ma'am." The confrontation was attracting attention from other staff members. Janet Holbrook appeared at Cassandra's elbow, her professional smile firmly in place. "Miss Storm, perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office." "Perhaps we should, because I'd like to understand how a facility can prescribe psychiatric medications to a man who was never psychiatrically evaluated." In Holbrook's office, the gloves came off completely. "Miss Storm, I'm going to be direct with you. Your grandfather was placed here by his legal guardian based on documented safety concerns. He has been resistant to care, verbally aggressive with staff, and has shown signs of paranoid ideation." Paranoid ideation? Like believing he was kidnapped from his home in the middle of the night? Like claiming that family members are conspiring against him, that staff are trying to harm him, and that he's being held against his will? What if those aren't paranoid delusions? What if they're accurate observations? Holbrook's final facade cracked. "Miss Storm, you can either be part of the solution or part of the problem. Your grandfather needs professional care. Fighting our protocols only makes his adjustment more difficult." His adjustment to what? To being a prisoner? To being forced chemically sedated so he can't protest his situation? To accepting help. To recognizing that his family made a difficult but necessary decision for his safety. And if I disagree with that decision, then I'm afraid you'll need to discuss that with his legal guardian. In the meantime, if your visits continue to be disruptive to Mr. Douglas's treatment, we may need to restrict them for his own good. The threat was clear. Cassandra could either accept the situation or lose access to Frank entirely. But she had one more card to play. "Ms. Holbrook, I'm an investigative journalist with the Chicago Tribune. I've been researching elder guardianship abuse for a story I'm working on. I wonder if you'd be willing to go on record about your policies regarding informed consent and patient rights." The color drained from her face. That would need to go through our corporate communications department." "Of course, I'll be sure to include Sunset Manor's corporate response in my article about systematic elder abuse in nursing homes." As Cassandra left the facility, she knew she had declared war on a system much larger and more powerful than one family's dysfunction. But she also knew that Frank was running out of time. Each day in that place was stealing more of who he was, one forced pill at a time. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Stop harassing the nursing home staff. Frank is getting the care he needs. Your interference is making things worse for everyone." Cassandra typed back, "We need to meet tonight. There are things about Frank's placement you need to know. The response came quickly. Fine. Millbrook Diner, 7 p.m. But this conversation ends tonight. As Cassandra drove back toward Millbrook, she realized she was about to confront not just her aunt, but the entire web of financial interests, legal shortcuts, and willful blindness that had enabled Frank's imprisonment. And she was beginning to understand that winning this battle would require more than family reconciliation. It would require exposing the truth about how America treated its most vulnerable elderly citizens.
The Millbrook Diner had been a fixture on Main Street for 40 years, its red vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floors unchanged since Cassandra's childhood. She arrived 30 minutes early, choosing a corner booth where she could see both entrances and spread out the documents she'd compiled over the past 2 days. Margaret arrived precisely at 7, accompanied by a man Cassandra didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase that screamed expensive attorney. Margaret's face was set in the same rigid expression of righteous determination that Cassandra remembered from childhood arguments. "Cassandra," Margaret slid into the opposite booth, her companion taking the seat beside her. "This is David Morrison, our family attorney. Given your threats about involving the media, I thought it best to have legal representation present." Morrison extended a manicured hand across the table. "Ms. Storm, I understand you have concerns about your grandfather's care situation. Perhaps we can address those concerns constructively." Cassandra ignored his hand and focused on Margaret. "Aunt Margaret, I need you to explain to me how a healthy, competent 83-year-old man ends up locked in a nursing home against his will while his house gets sold to developers." "Frank wasn't competent, Cassandra. You haven't been around to see his decline. I have Dr. Martinez's medical records showing he passed cognitive assessments 3 weeks before his placement. I have neighbor testimony confirming he was lucid and independent right up until the night he was taken. What decline?" Morrison leaned forward. "Miss Storm, family members often have difficulty accepting changes in elderly relatives. The signs of dementia can be subtle, and denial is a common response." "I'm not in denial. I'm looking at evidence." Cassandra pulled out her phone and played the recording she'd made of Frank's coherent recounting of his abduction. "Does this sound like dementia to you?" Margaret's face hardened as she listened to her father's voice describing the 2 a.m. removal, the destroyed house, and the forced medications. "He's been coached. Someone told him what to say." "Coached by whom? He's been locked up and sedated for 2 weeks." "By you. Yesterday. You filled his head with paranoid ideas about being kidnapped." Staring at her aunt in disbelief. "Margaret, I didn't coach him to remember events that happened before I even knew he'd been taken. Are you seriously suggesting I traveled back in time to plant false memories?" Morrison intervened smoothly. "Let's focus on moving forward constructively. Ms. Patterson has made a difficult decision based on her father's best interests. Rather than second-guessing that decision, perhaps we should discuss how to make Mr. Douglas's transition as comfortable as possible." "His transition to what? To being a zombie in a wheelchair? Because that's what your comfortable transition looks like." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under, Cassandra. Dad was becoming a burden." "A burden?" "That's not what I meant. He was becoming difficult, stubborn. He wouldn't listen to reason about selling the house and moving somewhere safer." "Safer for whom?" The question hung in the air as Margaret's face flushed red. Morrison placed a warning hand on her arm, but the damage was done. "Safer for the family," Margaret said finally. "The house was too much for him to maintain. The property taxes were eating up his pension. He was being foolish, clinging to a house he couldn't afford. According to his bank statements, he was managing his finances just fine. His pension covered all his expenses with money left over." "How did you get his bank statements?" "I'm an investigative journalist, Margaret. I know how to research financial records. What I found was a man living comfortably within his means with no debt and a modest savings account. What I didn't find was any evidence of financial distress or inability to care for himself."
Morrison leaned back, reassessing the situation. Miss Storm, even if we accept your version of events, the placement has been made. Reversing it would require a lengthy legal process, during which Mr. Douglas would remain in care anyway, unless his guardian chooses to release him voluntarily. That's not going to happen, Margaret said flatly. Why not? If there's no medical or legal reason to keep him locked up, why not let him go home? Margaret and Morrison exchanged glances before Morrison spoke. Miss Storm, there's something you need to understand about your grandfather's current situation. The house has been sold. His belongings have been disposed of. Even if we wanted to reverse the placement, there's no home for him to return to. The words hit Cassandra like a physical blow. You destroyed his home to make his imprisonment permanent? We liquidated his assets to pay for his long-term care. Sunset Manor costs $8,000 a month. Without the proceeds from the house sale, he couldn't afford to stay there. He doesn't want to stay there. He wants to go home. There is no home anymore, Margaret said with finality. What's done is done. Cassandra felt the world tilting around her. The systematic destruction of Frank's house, the sale to developers, and the elimination of his support network, it had all been designed to make his situation irreversible. Even if she could prove he was competent, even if she could expose the fraudulent placement, there was nowhere for him to go. You planned this, she said slowly. The anonymous complaint to Adult Protective Services, the emergency placement, the rushed house sale. You planned all of it to make sure he could never come back? I planned what was necessary to protect him from himself, Margaret replied, but her voice lacked conviction. To protect him? Or to protect your inheritance? Morrison's warning gesture came too late. Margaret's careful facade crumbled completely. Yes, fine, to protect the inheritance. Do you know what it's like, watching your father throw away the family's financial security out of stubborn sentimentality? That house was worth $300,000, Cassandra. $300,000 that could have helped Robert save the grain elevator, could have paid for my husband's medical bills, could have secured the family's future.
It was his house, Margaret. His money, his choice. His choice was going to bankrupt the entire family. Robert was going to lose the business. Tom needed surgery we couldn't afford. And Dad was just sitting in that house like a stubborn old fool, refusing to see reason. The confession hung between them like a toxic cloud. Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into his briefcase. So you had him declared incompetent and stole his house? I didn't steal anything. I used my legal authority as his power of attorney to make responsible financial decisions. After having him falsely imprisoned to prevent him from stopping you? Margaret's face was flushed with anger and shame. He's 83 years old, Cassandra. How many good years does he have left? 5? 10? Was I supposed to let him waste the family's only asset on his selfish need to live in the past? You were supposed to respect his rights and his choices. His choices were destroying the family. Morrison finally intervened. That's enough. Ms. Patterson, I think we should end this conversation. But Cassandra wasn't finished. Tell me about the emergency complaint to Adult Protective Services. Who made that anonymous report? Margaret's silence was answer enough. You did. You filed a false report claiming your own father was incompetent and in danger, knowing it would trigger an emergency placement before he could contest it. I reported legitimate concerns. You lied to government agencies to have your father kidnapped and imprisoned. Morrison stood abruptly. Ms. Storm, I'm going to advise my client to end this conversation immediately. Any further discussion should go through proper legal channels. But as they prepared to leave, Cassandra played her final card. Margaret, there's something else you need to know. I've been in contact with the FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force. What you've done isn't just unethical. It's federal elder abuse under the Elder Justice Act, fraudulent guardianship, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and deprivation of civil rights under color of legal authority. Margaret stopped dead. You can't prove any of that.
I can prove all of it. The medical records showing Frank's competency, the neighbor testimony about his condition, the rushed house sale, the false APS report, and now I have your confession recorded on my phone admitting you did it all for financial gain. Morrison's face had gone pale. Miss Storm, I'm going to advise you to recording private conversations without consent is illegal in South Dakota. Only if I intend to use them in court. But journalists operate under different rules when investigating matters of public interest, and elder abuse is definitely a matter of public interest. Margaret sank back into the booth, the weight of her situation finally hitting her. What do you want, Cassandra? I want Frank released immediately. I want him placed in a real assisted living facility where he can have dignity and autonomy, and I want you to use part of the proceeds from his house sale to make that happen. And if I refuse, then my article about systematic elder abuse in rural South Dakota gets published next week, with Sunset Manor, your attorney, and you featured prominently, along with a complete investigation by federal authorities who take elder abuse very seriously. Morrison leaned over to whisper urgently in Margaret's ear, but she waved him away. Even if I wanted to help, it's not that simple. The guardianship is court-ordered. I can't just walk into Sunset Manor and demand his release. You can petition the court to modify the guardianship. You can request a new competency evaluation by an independent physician. You can advocate for less restrictive placement. The legal fees alone would cost thousands. You just made $300,000 selling his house. I think you can afford it. Margaret stared at the table for a long moment, the full weight of her actions finally sinking in. I never meant it to go this far. When I first filed the power of attorney paperwork, I thought maybe he really was getting confused. Maybe it would be better for everyone if he was somewhere safe. But when you realized he wasn't confused, you doubled down instead of admitting the mistake. By then, the house was already sold. The legal wheels were in motion. I didn't know how to stop it. Morrison cleared his throat. Ms. Cotterson, I need to strongly advise you to not admit to any wrongdoing. It's too late for that. The wrongdoing is done. The question now is whether we can undo some of the damage. As they sat in the fluorescent-lit diner, surrounded by the ghosts of family dinners and childhood memories, Cassandra realized they had reached the moment that would define the rest of Frank's life. Margaret could continue down the path of legal manipulation and family destruction, or she could find the courage to admit her mistakes and try to make things right. I need time to think, and to talk to other lawyers about the best way to approach this. Frank doesn't have time, Margaret. Every day he spends in that place, he loses more of himself. The medications they're giving him aren't just controlling his behavior, they're erasing his personality. Margaret stood to leave, but turned back at the last moment. Cassandra, I want you to know, I do love him, even if it doesn't look that way now. I love my father. Then prove it. Give him back his life. As Margaret and Morrison left the diner, Cassandra sat alone with the wreckage of a family torn apart by fear, greed, and the terrible choices people make when they convince themselves that wrong actions serve right purposes. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Linda from Sunset Manor. Can you call me? It's about your grandfather. Something's happened.
Cassandra's hands were shaking as she dialed Linda's number in the diner parking lot. The phone rang 3 times before the familiar voice answered, but this time, Linda sounded strained and urgent. Miss Storm? Thank God you called back. It's about your grandfather. There's been an incident. What kind of incident? Is he hurt? He's missing. He left the facility sometime after dinner, and we can't find him anywhere. The words hit Cassandra like ice water. Missing? How does someone go missing from a locked facility? That's what we're trying to figure out. Security is reviewing the footage now, but somehow he got past all our protocols. Miss Storm, it's 40 degrees outside, and your grandfather is wearing just his pajamas and slippers. We need to find him quickly. Cassandra was already running toward her car. Have you caught the police?
They're on their way, but Miss Storm, there's something else. Before he disappeared, your grandfather was asking staff about a place called the Riverside Bridge. Does that mean anything to you?" The question stopped Cassandra cold. Riverside Bridge was a railroad trestle about 5 miles outside Millbrook, spanning the Little Missouri River. It was where Frank had proposed to Dorothy 60 years ago, where he'd taken Cassandra fishing as a child, where Dorothy's ashes had been scattered 5 years earlier. "I know where he is," Cassandra said, her voice barely a whisper. "Where? The police need to know immediately." But Cassandra was already speeding toward Millbrook, her mind racing through the implications. Frank hadn't just wandered away confused. He had gone somewhere specific, somewhere meaningful. In his medicated fog, some part of him had remembered the place that mattered most. The drive to Riverside Bridge took 20 minutes on winding country roads. Cassandra's headlights cut through the darkness as she navigated by memory, past abandoned farmhouses and fallow fields. When she finally reached the gravel access road leading to the bridge, she saw him. Frank Douglas sat on the railroad ties in the middle of the trestle, his thin frame outlined against the star-filled sky. He was exactly where Cassandra had expected to find him, in the spot where he and Dorothy used to watch trains pass overhead and plan their future together. She parked at the base of the bridge and walked carefully up the steep embankment, calling out so she wouldn't startle him. "Grandpa Frank? It's Cassie!" He turned toward her voice, and in the moonlight she could see that his eyes were clearer than they'd been in days. Whatever medication fog had clouded his mind seemed to have lifted. "Cassie, how did you find me?" "I know you, Grandpa Frank. I know the places that matter to you." She climbed onto the trestle and sat beside him, the old railroad ties solid and familiar beneath them. "Everyone's looking for you. The nursing home called the police." "I had to come here," he said simply. "I couldn't think straight in that place, couldn't remember who I was. But sitting here with Dorothy, it all comes back." Cassandra looked around the bridge, seeing it through his eyes. This wasn't just a structure spanning a river. It was a repository of memories, a place where the most important moments of his life had unfolded. "Tell me about it," she said. Frank's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "I brought Dorothy here on our 3rd date. She was afraid of heights, but she trusted me enough to walk out to the middle with me. We sat right here, and I told her about my dreams of working for the railroad, seeing the country, building something lasting." "What did she say?" "She said she didn't care about seeing the country as long as we could build something together. So I proposed to her right here, 6 months later. Carried the ring in my pocket for weeks, waiting for the right train to pass overhead." Cassandra smiled despite the gravity of their situation. "Did a train come?" "A freight train heading east, pulling grain cars, probably loaded with wheat from farms just like your dad's. When it passed over us, the whole bridge vibrated like music. Dorothy said yes before the noise even faded." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the river flowing beneath them and the distant sound of sirens approaching. "Grandpa Frank, why did you come here tonight?" Frank was quiet for a long time before answering. "Because I could feel myself disappearing, Cassie. In that place, with those medicines, I was losing pieces of myself every day. My memories were getting fuzzy, my thoughts were getting slow. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. But you remembered this place. This place is in my bones. Even when everything else gets confused, I can still feel Dorothy here with me. I can still remember who I am when I'm sitting where we planned our whole life together." The sirens were getting closer, but Cassandra made no move to signal their location. This conversation felt too important to interrupt. "Grandpa, what do you want? If you could have anything, what would it be?" "I want to go home, Cassie. Not to some facility where people talk to me like I'm a child. Home. To my house, my workshop, my garden." "But that's gone now, isn't it? Margaret sold it." Cassandra's heart broke at the resignation in his voice. "The house is gone, yes, but home doesn't have to be a specific building. Home can be wherever you feel like yourself. And where would that be? I can't live alone anymore. Margaret made sure of that when she had me declared incompetent. I can't drive. They took my license when they took everything else. What kind of home is left for someone like me? Before Cassandra could answer, flashlight beams began sweeping the area below them. Police officers and nursing home staff were spreading out to search the riverbank. "There! On the bridge!" someone called out.
Within minutes, they were surrounded by concerned voices and urgent questions. Linda from Sunset Manor climbed up to the trestle, her face a mixture of relief and professional concern. "Mr. Douglas, we've been so worried about you. Are you hurt? Are you cold?" "I'm fine," Frank said quietly. "Better than I've been in weeks." "We need to get you back to the facility and have you checked by a doctor. You've been missing for 3 hours in 40-degree weather." "I don't want to go back there." Linda's voice took on the patronizing tone Cassandra had heard so often. "I understand, Mr. Douglas. Change is hard for everyone. But you'll feel better once you're warm and have had your evening medications." "No," Frank's voice was firm. "I won't feel better. I'll feel nothing, which is what you want. But I'm not going back to that place." Police Officer Martinez, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, approached diplomatically. "Sir, we need to make sure you're safe. How about we get you warmed up and then figure out what comes next?" "What comes next is I get locked in a room and drugged until I forget this conversation ever happened," Frank replied. Cassandra stood up, placing herself between Frank and the growing crowd of officials. "Officer Martinez, my grandfather isn't under arrest, is he?" "No, ma'am. This is a welfare check." "Then he has the right to refuse to return to the nursing home." Linda interjected quickly. "Miss Storm, your grandfather is under a legal guardianship. He can't make those kinds of decisions for himself." "Based on what medical evidence? He's been sitting here for 3 hours, in the cold, giving me a completely coherent account of his life and his wishes. Does that sound like someone who's incapacitated?" Officer Martinez looked between them uncertainly. "Ma'am, I'm not qualified to make medical or legal determinations. I just need to ensure everyone's safety." "Then let's get him somewhere warm while we sort this out. But not back to Sunset Manor. Not until there's been a proper evaluation by an independent physician." "That's not how this works," Linda protested. "Mr. Douglas is a ward of the state under guardianship. He can't make those kinds of decisions for himself." But Frank had been listening to this exchange with growing clarity and determination. "Officer Martinez, I want to file a complaint." "What kind of complaint, sir?" "Kidnapping. False imprisonment. I want to report that I was taken from my home against my will and held in a facility where I was drugged to prevent me from seeking help." The night suddenly got very complicated. Linda stepped forward urgently. "Mr. Douglas is confused and paranoid due to his condition. These are classic symptoms of dementia-related delusions." "Delusions?" Frank's voice grew stronger. "I can tell you exactly what medications you've been giving me without my informed consent. Lorazepam, quepatine, trazodone. I can tell you the names of the staff members who threatened to increase my dosage if I didn't cooperate with treatment I never needed. I can tell you about the meeting where Janet Holbrook threatened my granddaughter for asking too many questions about my care." Officer Martinez was taking notes now, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sir, those are very specific allegations." "They're not allegations. They're facts, and I want them investigated." Cassandra pulled out her phone and played Frank's recorded account of his abduction from 2 nights earlier. In the cold night air, surrounded by officials who had expected to find a confused old man, Frank's clear, detailed recounting of events sounded like the testimony of a credible witness, not a delusional patient. "Officer Martinez," Cassandra said when the recording ended, "I'm an investigative journalist with the Chicago Tribune. I've been researching this case for the past 3 days. I have medical records, witness testimony, and documented evidence of systematic abuse. My grandfather isn't paranoid. He's the victim of elder abuse disguised as medical care." The dynamics on the bridge shifted dramatically. What had started as a simple recovery of a missing nursing home patient was becoming a potential criminal investigation. Linda was speaking rapidly into her phone, probably calling Sunset Manor's legal department. Officer Martinez was calling for backup and supervisory support. Other officials were photographing the scene and taking statements. But in the middle of all the official chaos, Frank took Cassandra's hand and spoke quietly. "Whatever happens next, Cassie, I want you to know, sitting here tonight, remembering who I am, feeling like myself again, this is the first time in 2 weeks I've felt human. Whatever they do to me tomorrow, tonight I remembered that I'm still Frank Douglas. I'm still Dorothy's husband. I'm still your grandfather. And I'm still worth fighting for." As police cars and ambulances filled the access road below them, as phones rang and officials argued jurisdiction and protocols, Cassandra realized they had reached the turning point she'd been fighting towards. Frank had found his voice again, remembered his strength, and chosen to fight for his own freedom. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since that midnight phone call, Cassandra believed they could win it. "Yes, Grandpa," she said, squeezing his hand. "You are absolutely worth fighting for. And now everyone knows it."
The emergency room at Rapid City Regional Hospital buzzed with late-night activity as Frank Douglas underwent what would become the most important medical evaluation of his life. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, had insisted on a complete neurological and psychiatric assessment after hearing about the circumstances surrounding Frank's escape from Sunset Manor. Cassandra sat in the waiting room, her laptop open as she typed furiously, documenting every detail of the past 4 days for the article that would expose the systematic elder abuse she'd uncovered. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Calls from Margaret's attorney, from Sunset Manor's corporate office, from Adult Protective Services officials who suddenly wanted to clarify their earlier actions. But the most important call came from Detective Rebecca Santos of the South Dakota Attorney General's Elder Abuse Task Force. "Ms. Storm, I've reviewed the preliminary reports from last night. Officer Martinez forwarded your recordings and documentation. I need to meet with you and your grandfather as soon as possible." 3 hours later, Dr. Chen emerged from the examination room with results that would change everything. "Ms. Storm, I've completed a comprehensive cognitive assessment of your grandfather. He scored 29 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination. That's well within normal range for his age. His Montreal cognitive assessment was similarly excellent. There are no signs of dementia, confusion, or psychiatric illness." What about the medications he was given at Sunset Manor? That's more concerning. The combination of drugs in his system would cause significant cognitive impairment in anyone, regardless of age. Essentially, he was being chemically restrained with medications that had no medical justification. Dr. Chen's report became the cornerstone of Detective Santos's investigation. Within 24 hours, search warrants were executed at Sunset Manor, Thomas Brennan's law office, and the property development company that had purchased Frank's house. What they found painted a picture of systematic elder abuse that went far beyond Frank's case. Sunset Manor had been operating what Santos called a medication mill, routinely oversedating residents to reduce staffing costs and minimize complaints from families. Dr. Reeves, the absent physician, had been rubber-stamping medication orders without examining patients. The facility's corporate owners had been billing Medicare for intensive psychiatric care while providing minimal actual medical services. Thomas Brennan's files revealed a pattern of rushed guardianship cases, all involving elderly clients with valuable real estate. In each case, anonymous complaints had been filed with Adult Protective Services just days before lucrative property sales. Most damning was the discovery of email communications between Margaret, Brennan, and the development company showing that Frank's house sale had been planned months before his placement at Sunset Manor. The legal wheels turned quickly once federal investigators got involved. Within a week, Frank's guardianship was overturned by an emergency court order. Margaret's power of attorney was revoked, and criminal charges were filed against multiple parties involved in the scheme. But the most important transformation happened on a sunny Thursday morning when Frank walked out of Rapid City Regional Hospital as a free man. Cassandra had spent the week researching senior living options that would give Frank independence while providing appropriate support.
Instead of institutional care, she had found Prairie Winds, a senior community in Sioux Falls that offered independent living apartments with optional services. "It's your choice, Grandpa," she said as they drove through the Prairie Winds campus. "You can see what you think, and if you don't like it, we'll find something else." Frank sat quietly as they toured the community. Apartments with full kitchens, a workshop space where residents could pursue hobbies, gardens where people could grow their own vegetables, and most importantly, no locked doors or medication schedules imposed without consent. "The residents here aren't patients," explained Maria Rodriguez. "They're neighbors. We provide support when people need it, but we don't make decisions for them." In the workshop, Frank met Henry Kowalski, an 80-year-old retired mechanic who was restoring a 1940s radio. "You ever work on trains?" Henry asked, showing Frank his collection of vintage electronics. 42 years with the railroad," Frank replied, his eyes lighting up for the first time in weeks. "Well, then you'll want to see this." Henry led them to a corner where he'd been building a model railroad layout. "Been working on this for 3 years. Could use someone who knows the real thing." As Frank examined the detailed miniature locomotives and discussed track layouts with Henry, Cassandra saw something she hadn't seen since before his placement at Sunset Manor: genuine joy and engagement. "The Railroad Museum in town has been looking for someone to help catalog their collection," Maria mentioned. "A lot of the residents volunteer there. The work is meaningful and it keeps people connected to their passions." That afternoon, Frank made his decision. "I'd like to try living here, Cassie. It feels like a place where I could be useful again."
The move happened quickly. Cassandra helped Frank select furniture and personal items to create a space that felt like home. Most of his original belongings had been destroyed, but neighbors from Millbrook surprised him by bringing items they'd rescued from the cleanup crews. Photographs, books, small mementos that connected him to his past life. Mrs. Henderson brought his favorite coffee mug and a cutting from Dorothy's rosebush. "Thought you might want to start a new garden," she said, tears in her eyes. The prenatal trials that followed made national news. Cassandra's article in the Chicago Tribune, "The Guardianship Trap: How Elder Abuse Hides Behind Legal Loopholes," sparked congressional hearings and legislative reform efforts. Margaret pled guilty to elder abuse and fraud charges, receiving 3 years of probation and community service. The judge ordered her to pay restitution for Frank's legal fees and relocation costs. During her sentencing, she stood before the court and finally spoke the words Frank had needed to hear. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to my father. I convinced myself I was protecting him, but I was really protecting myself from financial problems I was too proud to admit. I stole his freedom, his dignity, and almost his life because I was desperate and scared. There's no excuse for what I did." Frank, sitting in the courtroom gallery, nodded slightly but said nothing. Later, he would tell Cassandra that forgiveness was a process, not a moment, and that Margaret would have to earn her way back into his life. Sunset Manor's corporate owners faced federal charges and massive fines. The facility was placed under new management with strict oversight protocols. Dr. Reeves lost his medical license, and Thomas Brennan was disbarred. But for Frank, the most meaningful victory was smaller and more personal. 6 months after his escape from Sunset Manor, he stood in the Rapid City Railroad Museum, leading a tour group through exhibits he had helped create. His work cataloging the museum's collection uncovered historically significant documents and photographs that told the story of railroad development across the Great Plains. This locomotive, he told a group of fascinated schoolchildren, pulled grain cars from farms like my grandson's great-grandfather owned. The railroad didn't just move trains, it moved dreams, crops, families, and the future of America westward. In the audience, Cassandra watched her grandfather share his passion with the new generation, his eyes bright with purpose and his voice strong with authority earned through experience. After the tour, they walked to the museum's research library, where Frank had been working on a project that would preserve railroad history for future generations. The walls were covered with photographs he'd organized chronologically, showing the evolution of steam engines, the faces of workers who built the lines, and the communities that grew up around train stations. "You know what the best part is, Cassie?" Frank said as he showed her his latest cataloging work. All those documents Margaret's cleanup crew threw away, some of them survived. People in Millbrook kept pieces, thinking they might be important someday. Mrs. Henderson brought me a box last week, correspondence between my father and the railroad company from the 1920s, history that almost got lost forever. As they prepared to leave for the day, Frank paused at a photograph of workers laying track across an endless prairie. You know what I used to think the most important thing was the destination? Getting the train from one place to another. But I learned something these past months. Sometimes the most important thing is proving you can still make the journey. That evening, in his apartment at Prairie Winds, Frank called Cassandra as she sat in her Chicago office, working on a follow-up article about elder care reform legislation inspired by his case. "Cassie, I wanted to thank you again for not giving up on me." "You never gave up on yourself, Grandpa. You just needed someone to remind you that your voice still mattered." "It matters because you listened, and because you helped me remember that even at 83, I still have stories worth telling and work worth doing." Outside his window, Frank could see other residents tending the community garden where he had planted Dorothy's roses. The plants had taken root and were already showing new growth, proving that with proper care and respect, beautiful things could flourish at any age. The phone call from that terrifying midnight weeks ago had changed both their lives. It had exposed a system designed to warehouse rather than honor the elderly, but it had also revealed the power of family love, journalistic integrity, and one old man's refusal to disappear quietly into institutional care. Frank Douglas was home, not in the house where he'd lived for 57 years, but in a life where he was valued, respected, and free to choose his own path forward. And in helping him reclaim his life, Cassandra had discovered that sometimes the most important stories aren't about corruption in high places, but about ordinary people refusing to let their loved ones be forgotten. At 83, Frank Douglas was writing new chapters, not just ending old ones. And his granddaughter had learned that family isn't just about where you come from, it's about who you're willing to fight for when they can't fight for themselves. The story that began with a desperate phone call had become a testament to the truth that every person, regardless of age, deserves to live with dignity, purpose, and the fundamental right to determine their own destiny. Frank's voice, silenced for those terrible weeks, was now stronger than ever, and it would continue to tell stories, teach history, and inspire others for many years to come.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.